This is our last lecture on crime in the media. We're in session 16, and it will be your last lecture before our final exam at the end of the semester. In this discussion, we're going to look at work from Goldstein's Why We Watch. In that book, he has several, a compilation of articles that try to determine why violence is attractive and why it's marketable, why we actually spend our money to participate in violent entertainment. After I saw him, you've probably watched Natural Born Killers since then. I showed it in class. I saw it when it originally came out in the theaters in 1995. Myself, my husband, and a group of friends went. We came out. I loved the film at that point. And when I started to teach this course, I thought, oh, well, that'll be perfect. I'm going to show this film in this course. When I saw it for a second time, 10 years later, I was really pretty stunned by how violent it was. I had forgotten the extent to which it was violent. And I began to think, why did we go to that film in 1995? And in Boston at that time, movie tickets were $7.50 a piece on a graduate student's budget. That was a lot of money. Why did we spend our money to watch this film? What was it about this film that we thought was so great and had to go back? And it really does beg the question. I think one of the more interesting questions when we talk about crime in the media or violence in the media is, why are such films marketable? Why do we continue to consume this type of media? Those of us who are not likely to ever commit a crime, not likely to ever act violently, or if we do act violently in a very benign way, maybe a small fight at a bar, or but nothing that we would consider violence on the scale of a Natural Born Killers type of violent act. Why do we, though, still watch this? I'm watching The Walking Dead now, and I really enjoy the scenes where the walkers are killed. Why do I enjoy that? What kind of social and psychological need does the consumption of violence fill? And what kind of purpose does it have socially? In order to answer some of these questions, I think it's important, again, to think about what we know about violent entertainment. I've mentioned this a little bit before, but violent entertainment isn't new. It's been around for millennia. We can think of hundreds of examples of how violence has been proposed as entertainment. The lion and tiger fights in ancient Rome, the gladiator fights, the games, early narratives of saints in Christianity. They're called hagiographies. Many of them are extraordinarily violent and detailed, explicitly violent. We know that folk tales across cultures are violent. I mentioned before that Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother is eaten by Little Red Riding Hood in one version of the tale. So we know that violence has been consumed across the course of human existence. It's not new, and it's not something that we invented with the advent of television and video games. We also know that it's cross-cultural. Gerbner argues in a film I may be posting, I'll let you know if I end up posting it, that the reason why we do see an increase in violent films today being produced and sold is because violence actually is very, very marketable internationally. He argues this for a couple reasons. One, violence in films doesn't have to be translated. So we don't have to worry about dubbing film. We don't have to worry about an international audience catching nuances of phrases or a turn of a phrase that might lead to a major character information about a major character. Violence is just strictly what it is. It's easy to interpret. It's easy to interpret multinationally, and it sells. It sells cheaply globally. So films that are violent today are very, very marketable, and they're marketable cross-culturally. So we see violence in produced now in a way in which that international market is actually many times more lucrative than the domestic market in which the film is produced. We also see that violent films do have niches within their own cultural market. There's a type of Italian film called giallo. These are actually quite violent Italian horror films. They're filmed in Italy. They're filmed in Italian. It's they're called giallo films, and they're basically like our slasher films here in the U.S. But it's a particular genre that grew up in Italy and is a homegrown way in which violence is consumed. Manga. I always pronounce that incorrectly, or manga, can also be violent in different ways. It's a form of animation. Some of it is directed towards children. Most of it has an adult audience. But there are some themes in manga that are quite violent. There are others that actually aren't, that are really pretty benign, but we see that it's consumed in that market as well. So we know that violence is historical, and that violence, the consumption of violent media is cross-cultural. So who watches? Well, again, cross-culturally, men are more likely to consume violent media than women. Now, the why is not really pressed out yet very well in terms of the research, but we do know that men are more drawn to violent entertainment. And it's not just violent entertainment in film or on TV, it's all sorts of violent entertainment. Boxing, cockfighting, pit bull fighting, even some might say football is a form of violent entertainment. And that men are more likely to participate, and men are more likely to enjoy watching these types of entertainment. Again, this is cross-cultural, and it's also cross-age groups. So it's not as if children are more likely to enjoy violent entertainment, cops and robbers and violent video games, but we see also well into adulthood men enjoying video games, violent films, crime TV shows, to some extent more so than women. Now we have two basic arguments as to why this might be the case. Is it related to biology? Is there some hormonal reason why men are more interested in violent media than women? Some biochemical reason? Or is it just socialization that creates an attraction to these forms of entertainment? And again, I mean, this is an age-old debate, nature or nurture, and what causes this attraction to violence. But regardless of gender, we do know that those, male or female, who have feelings of aggression and need to have high levels of sensation seeking, majority of them are men, but there are some women who pursue risk, enjoy sensation seeking, that they're more likely to want to consume violent entertainment. So there is some relationship between feelings of aggression and the need to experience risk and sensations, skydiving, roller coaster riding, all of those risky or presumably risky behaviors. We know that men are more likely to take part in than women. This is true of drug use, crime, many different things. And we know that this occurs actually at a young age. Colin and Stanley found that preschoolers with higher levels of felt aggression were actually more attracted to violent fairy tales. So they've told them various fairy tales. Those fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood or Hansel and Gretel that had an element of violence or victimization attached were more attractive to those with higher levels of felt aggression. Again, I think it's interesting that, again, if you think back to my little test with my own children about the Little Red Riding Hood story, that children at a very young age are reading these the gendered roles, the roles of victims into stories that we as adults often think are quite benign. All right, Macaulay did a study of both men and women to try and determine to what extent people could tolerate violence in film. He argued there must be a threshold, that there's a point where people have to look away. It's no longer attractive to watch violence. And he wanted to find out what that threshold was. And so he measured, he showed participants various clips of violence. He tried to categorize these into two different types of violent behavior. The first he called instrumental violence. Instrumental violence was violence that was committed, pain that was inflicted, but not because there was any enjoyment of the pain or the violence. It was meant to have some instrumental end. There was no violent intention. So an image of a surgery being performed without anesthesia, or an image of a cow being slaughtered, but being slaughtered for food. Those would be instances of instrumental violence. He also used a video of a monkey. There are groups that will expose a monkey's brain while the monkey's still living and eat the monkey's brain. Again, a very violent act, but the point of the act is for food, not necessarily to inflict pain on the monkey. Now, some of us might disagree with that, but that was one of the clips that he showed the participants. He also showed them clips of impulsive violence. And those that showed impulsive violence was when a violent act was committed for revenge or just simply for pleasure, that the agent of violence had violent intentions. This would be someone who just enjoyed causing pain for torture or for revenge or for pleasure. And he speculated at first that this distinction between pleasurable violence and instrumental violence would be noted by the viewer, and that viewers wouldn't be able to watch impulsive violence as long as they were able to watch instrumental violence. Now, what he found actually was that this didn't necessarily hold true. And so he went back to try and see what, if people don't necessarily read the difference between instrumental and impulsive violence, why can we still tolerate watching? And he said because so many forms of violence on TV have become impersonal, and we don't necessarily read that distinction between impulsive and instrumental as clearly as he thought we might. So he turned to the idea that maybe it's actually just fiction. Maybe it's the ability to distinguish between real and unreal violence that causes us to tolerate or not tolerate violence in the media. And actually, that's what he found, was that violence in play or film or other forms of entertainment, if there are cues that show that this is not real, again, that this is play, you have the code word that says off, stop, stop, and people stop, you know it's play, then you can tolerate it. But at the point where it starts to become real or feel real or look real, then it starts to lose its appeal and people begin to turn away. Now in class, I asked the students to think about a film that the violence was uncomfortable because it was starting to become too real. That the film had lost the cues, pointing to the fact that this was real or unreal play. They cited a few. There was a scene, again, I'm dating myself, but if you've seen Deer Hunter, which is a really early, I believe, late 80s, early 90s film with Christopher Walken. There's a torture scene in that film, which is, I think, extremely uncomfortable. And because it is depicting pleasurable violence, and there's not a lot of non-diegetic sound in the scene, meaning there's not the soundtrack. It's a pretty silent scene. We don't see a lot of lighting cues. We don't see a lot of other visual representations that let us know that violence is fake. And so it becomes pretty difficult to watch. If you think about some of the violence that we see on TV, even Roadrunner cartoons, if we were to replace the Roadrunner or the coyote with a real coyote and a real Roadrunner and see that violence, we would interpret it quite differently, because the visual cues that say it's fiction, mainly animation, would be turned off, and therefore we would have very little tolerance for that type of violent act. So while you're watching TV this week, think about those cues that we see that let us know that it's fictitious violence, and how we would be able to watch this if it did turn off. How would we react if we no longer thought that this violent act was actually fictitious? Okay, there's another interesting explanation for why we watch violent media. This actually comes from Freud, not Stephen King, but Stephen King has a nice quote that goes along with it. It's called the social subconscious hypothesis. And basically, he says that horror films show us that those things which trouble the night thoughts of a whole society generally show up in forms of violent entertainment. Freud's influence is actually relatively, it's taken for granted, I believe. But had he not come up with the whole idea of dreams being a way of exploring the subconscious mind, I don't think we would have Stephen King saying this about horror films. But Freud's idea that there is a subconscious, that we don't always understand or realize our motives or can even express them, and that dreams are one way to tap into what our subconscious thoughts might be, dealing with things that we can't in real life. That's really at the heart of what this idea is. The idea has been expanded, though, by a lot of social scientists to say that actually we have a social subconscious, that collectively we have unspoken fears and threats and concerns which we really can't deal with in a real world type of setting. We really can't process in real life. So they come out in dreams, and those dreams are forms of entertainment or cultural expressions of those fears. I like to think of, again, King says we make up horror to help us deal with the real ones. So we make up stories to help us deal with those things which really scare us in real life. Around the 1999, as we went to 2000, around that period, there was a lot of shows on TV about the X-Files was popular. Millennium was the show that was on at that time. It was a very mystical, creepy, kind of violent show. This idea of the unknown was very, very popular around that time. And I always saw that as being very reflective of social concerns about the turn of the century and walking into the unknown, what might happen as we move on into the future. And that's not uncommon to see around turns of the century. I'll talk later about why I think we see a lot of vampire and zombie films today. It also connects with this idea that we have to deal with some things that threaten us in real life. But I'll save that for another slide. There's this idea that films, violent media, acts as a catharsis. I'm not going to go through all this. This lecture's becoming long. And then basically the idea is that if we feel aggression, if we experience it vicariously through film, we'll be rid of that aggression. It'll calm us down. We'll be rid of those unhealthy emotions and be able to act normally and interact in a healthy way with other people around us. Actually, the hypothesis is partly true and partly false. The idea that men who might show more evidence of aggression are attracted to entertainment might support this, that it's that aggression that draws them to this entertainment. However, violent films, if you've experienced them like I have, they don't calm us down or rid us of those types of aggressive emotions at all. In fact, they tend to increase anxiety, they increase feelings of violence, they increase a propensity towards anger. If any of you have seen a really exciting film, I mean, films are meant to evoke emotion. If you've come out of film that's been really exciting, you've probably left that film pretty pumped. I had a student in class Tuesday talk about how he saw Fast Five and he was driving so fast on the way home because he just wanted to drive as fast as he could after seeing that film. Films don't act as a catharsis. In fact, if anything, they kind of concentrate those emotions that we have. That's why they're marketable. That's what they're meant to do. They're meant to tell a narrative in a very compelling and emotional type way. So the second part of this idea that they act as a catharsis and rid us of unhealthy emotions isn't necessarily been found to be true. Okay, I've mentioned this when we talked about Little Red Riding Hood, that violence serves as social control, or violent images, violent media. We know from criminology that informal social control, or the control of our neighbors, the control of stories, the control of our friends and family, saying, you're wearing that, I don't want you to wear that, or you're doing what on Friday? Those types of informal means of controlling our behavior are much more effective than formal mechanisms of control, laws, courts. The threat of arrest is much less effective at teaching us how to act than actually those systems of informal control that we see every day. And entertainment is one of those forms of social control that we're constantly engaged with every day. So like fairy tales or slasher films or teen movies, we tend to see the consequences of bad behavior played out for us in violent images and in violent media. So it also reinforces some of those social lessons that we've learned in other places of our lives: school, family, churches. Okay. Two more. There's an idea that violence in the media helps reaffirm a social identity, and in fact it can even teach us gender roles. One, that it supports identity formation. We tend to see violent films in groups. In fact, very infrequently do we view violence, well, probably more so now with the ready availability of film through social media, but normally, if we watch something violent, extremely violent, we do so in groups. This helps confirm our role in that group, our identity as a group member. It promotes social bonding within that group. And Zillman even argues it reaffirms gender role expression. So if we go on a date and there's a scary part in the film, girls are allowed to express fear. Girls are allowed to hide. Girls are allowed to talk about something else with their other friends. Men aren't necessarily given those same options. I asked how many men in class cried or looked away, cried at a sad part of a film if they were with their buddies, not with their girlfriends, but if they went to a film with another group of men, would they cry? Most of them said no. If the film became scary, would they look away? Or very violent, would they look away? And they were in the presence of other men. Most of them said no. There are ways in which these reinforce gender ideals that men should be brave, men should be able to take it, men should be able to experience violence and come out okay in the end, but women can be protected. Zillman saw this even in terms of how boys and girls interact. Girls would socialize and talk during tense sequences of violence in film. Boys would watch, and they wouldn't turn away, but in order to ease the tension, they would actually discuss the technicalities of the scene. Oh, that's so lame. That blood looks so fake. Boy, those special effects they look stupid. I don't believe that this is really happening. And they would discuss the fictitiousness of the scene in order to relieve that tension and focus on the technicalities. So they watched, but they watched it and turned it into the suspension that they were giving it to call it a real event, like I'm being entertained by maybe a real narrative in the film. They would turn that off and emphasize all those cues that told you that it was a fictitious event. Okay, and this is our last one. I really like this explanation for why we like film, violence in film. Of course, there's no way to really test this idea. Not an easy way that I can think of. But one of the articles in Goldstein was written by a historian, and she argued that the social location of death has changed itself in our history. And one of the reasons why we see more violence in film today, if you remember Gerbner's idea that the body count increases, one of the reasons why we see that escalation of violence in more modern film is because death has become removed from our everyday experience. It's become removed from our lived experience and has become institutionalized. And by institutionalized, if we think historically, death was experienced frequently in families, even just 100 years ago. Women were far more likely to die in childbirth. Children were far more likely to die in infancy and even in early childhood. We had less access to health care. Fewer technological resources to address health problems that we do now. So death was just far more common. Death was also experienced at home or intimately. Funerals were held at home. I don't know if any of you have relatives, but I had a great-grandmother that would keep a picture of her husband from his funeral. He was in his coffin on her nightstand. So images of people on their deathbeds were not unusual. There was an intimacy between death and families that has since been lost. She argued that death has become one, removed from private discourse. We don't necessarily talk about it. We don't necessarily believe it should actually really occur. If you think about someone, and I'm sure you've heard this, maybe you hear that someone that you know has gotten cancer. My mother had cancer, and I heard this a lot. Yes, my mother's been diagnosed with cancer. Oh, was she a smoker? As if there's something unusual about having cancer or unusual about dying from cancer, and that there must have been some behavior that she participated in that caused that death. That death isn't natural, and death isn't normal in that kind of way. So it's become institutionalized. We die in institutions and hospitals and hospices. It's become depersonalized in that we don't necessarily experience that death intimately. And we've begun to, if you think about how you try to console someone who's lost a loved one, that's removed to private discourse. Well, what do I say? And you whisper. It's not really a topic of conversation. It's not something that we deal with very well or accept very well in modern life. But she goes on to argue this is one reason why we see this in film, because we still have the need to discuss and experience the social reality of death and dying. We still have to process this fact of human existence, that we die, that people suffer, that there is pain. And she argues that film allows for these types of vicarious experiences. Now, I promise you I talk about vampires and zombies. I think that's one of the things, one of the reasons why we see this emergence in recent media with the fascination of vampires and zombies. We're really interested in the dead but undead right now. And I think that that's interesting in the light that we think that death can be postponed, that medicine can cure everything, and again, that death is an anomaly. So what do we do when people are ill? And I've often wondered if the vampire, the zombie, the flawed, the individual that is clearly not alive but clearly not dead, isn't one way in which we're working through this idea that death is permanent. Is death not permanent? Does death change us in a way that is irrevocable? Again, we see in the media kind of this social subconscious working out of what death might mean to us socially. On that cheery note, that ends our